I'm Keith Birchler. I'm a local attorney here in Bay City. I'm not a Bay City native, but I moved here in 1978 when I got out of law school, when Bob Sarow hired me to work at his law firm. And Bob worked his whole career as a lawyer here in Bay City. He retired from our firm about 11 years ago, I believe. And Bob grew up in Saginaw, but he had connections to Bay City. His uncle Dave King and Dave's family were lawyers in Bay City for 3 generations. So Bob, being a King on his mother's side, was a 4th generation lawyer in Bay City, Michigan.
It's actually 5.
5. Oh, I missed a generation. So I was very fortunate that Bob and his other partners at the time hired me to come and work here, and I've had a great career. I'm still working, and our firm is still active and in existence. Today's presentation arises out of an email that I got at my office, and it led to the creation of this program. So one day, November 1st, 2018, I get the following email from a Major Adam Kama of the U.S. Army. He says he's an amateur Army historian, an attorney. He's researching the court-martial of 2nd Lieutenant Jackie Robinson. Yes, that Jackie Robinson. I have reason to suspect your firm's founder, Robert H. Johnson, was instrumental defense attorney in Jackie Robinson's acquittal of 2 purely military offenses at Camp Hood, Texas in August 1944. I understand Mr. Johnson died sometime in 1951. Would your firm's partners at the time you joined the firm in the 70s, have mentioned Mr. Johnson to you? Did they mention my suspicion that he was Jackie Robinson's defense attorney? Any information you have would be helpful. I'm sorry to reach out of the blue. He says he's drafting an article for the Army JAG Corps Law Review. The JAG Corps is the Judge Advocate General Corps. Those are the officers in the Army who serve as prosecutors and also as defense attorneys when Army members are charged with offenses. So he says I can be reached by phone or email. So what did I do? I called him up. I said, well, hello, Major Kama. I don't know a whole lot about Mr. Johnson. I know he was one of the founders in our firm, but he died so long ago I really don't know much. But our firm has kind of an unofficial historian, Bob Sarow. And Bob's retired, but I'll reach out to Bob. And so I did. I called Bob. And but before I did that, I said, how did you find us and how did you make this connection? And he said, well, Google. You've got a website. So this is the unpaid commercial presentation here. That's the headshot of first page of our website. And on our website, we have a little history section. And it says, the firm evolved from an association of Lloyd W. Bartlett and Robert H. Johnson in the practice of law in 1945 with offices in Bay City's Phoenix building. In 1946, they were joined by David L. King, Bob Sarow's uncle, and the 3 continued their association under the firm name Bartlett, Johnson, and King until the untimely death of Mr. Johnson in 1951. And we go on and we have some other history there, but we all kind of consider that the origins of our firm. And the Bay Area Chamber of Commerce says that we've been members there since 1946. And even though the firm today has got other names, we can trace our history right back to Mr. Johnson. So I called Bob, and Bob said, well, I know the Johnson family well. His children I did legal work for, and I've known them for years. So he connected me with the names of Bob Johnson's children, Howard Johnson and Arlene Strumming. And Bob said, we should have some information on them in our records, and you could contact them. So I pulled it up while I was talking to Bob. I pulled it up on my computer, and I found Howard's address and Arlene's address. And so at the risk of violating client confidentiality, and without calling Howard and Arlene first, I did call Major Kama back, and I gave them their names and I gave them their addresses. And I said, I think they'd probably be happy to hear from you. And so a few days later, on November 5th, I get this email from Major Kama. It's him! First Lieutenant Robert H. Johnson, who defended Jackie Robinson at court-martial, is Robert Hubbard Johnson, Esquire, of Bay City, Michigan. Also an alum of the University of Michigan Law, by the way. I just got off the phone with Ms. Stremming. Exciting stuff. And then he asked me to call him, and I called him back, and we talked a little bit. But basically, Major Kama had been doing this research because the transcript of the trial and all the Army records don't really give Mr. Johnson credit for being the defense attorney. And we'll get into some of the details of that a little bit later. But that's how this all started, this idea for this talk, and the research to find out a little bit more about our firm's founder. Before we get into the details of the trial and Mr. Johnson's role and so on, I'm going to sit down and let Bob talk to you about Jackie Robinson, because that's a real important part of this story. And Bob's got kind of a condensed version of Jackie Robinson's life, and I think you're going to find it really interesting. So, Bob?
Yeah, one facet on this, too, Bob Johnson's wife, Jane, was my mother's best friend. They were born in Bay City just about 2 months apart from each other. And all their lives, my mother passed away first, but throughout their lives they remained in close touch with each other. But what I'm going to do is give some biographical information concerning Jackie Robinson, and Keith's going to take care of the lawyerly part with the court-martial itself after my presentation. And to start out with, I'm relying on the source of this information primarily on Jackie Robinson's autobiography titled "I Never Had It Made." I see I brought the copy of the book here, and also on a independent biography called Jackie Robinson, authored by Arnold Rampersan, R-A-M-P-E-R-S-A-N, which is generally regarded to be the best of many Robinson biographies. And I'll refer to this on occasion in this presentation, just Rapperson indicated this or that. So to start with, Jackie Roosevelt Robinson was born January 31, 1919, and I'm not sure the pronunciation, Cairo or Cairo, C-A-I-R-O, Georgia. His middle name was a tribute to Teddy Roosevelt. He was the fifth of 5 children, 1 girl and 4 boys, including Jack. His parents were Jerry and Mallie, M-A-L-L-I-E, Robinson. His father, Jerry, left home 6 months after Jack's birth and never returned, so Jack never knew his father. In May 1920, when Jack was 1 year, 4 months old, Molly, with her 5 children, moved to Pasadena, California. And yeah, this is the family here. And Molly in the center with the 5 children. Left to right are Mac, Jack, Edgar, Willa Mae, and Frank. I've been concerned that Keith's going to get the wrong visual up with my presentation, but so far he's doing well. Mally was a devout Methodist who attended church every Sunday, but without having any inclination toward dogma or self-righteousness. In 1938, when Jack was 19 years old, Carl Downs, who then was 25, became the pastor of his mother's church, the Pasadena Methodist Church. And years later, in his autobiography, Jack wrote, Carl Downs had the ability to communicate with you spiritually, and at the same time, he was fun to be with. He participated with us in sports. Most importantly, he knew how to listen. When I was deeply concerned about personal crises, I went to him. And Jack's biographer, Arnold Rappersand, said, Downs became a conduit through which Molly's message of religion and hope finally flowed into Jack's consciousness. As he reached manhood, faith in God began to register in him as both a mysterious force beyond his comprehension and a pragmatic way to negotiate the world. Now, Jack attended the Pasadena Public Schools. He is a C student, but excelled in sports. He had a paper route, mowed grass for neighbors, sold hot dogs at ball games in the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. When Jack graduated from high school, the Pasadena Star-News reported, for 2 years, Jack Robinson has been the outstanding athlete at Muir High School, starring in football, basketball, track, baseball, and tennis. In 1938, Jack was named most valuable player in the Junior College Baseball League, with which Pasadena Junior College was affiliated. And the college newspaper pronounced him the greatest base runner ever to play on a junior college team and one of the most sensational fielders in the business. Also in 1938, he played on the Pasadena Junior College basketball and football teams, and at the conclusion of the football season, he withdrew from the college without getting a degree. He had already been recruited by several university football programs, including University of Oregon, University of California, and UCLA, whose football coach called him one of the greatest open field football players I have ever seen. And Jack chose UCLA. His biographer Ramperson writes, UCLA was a friendly place for the black student, and the gifted black athlete was welcomed. In 1940 through 41 at UCLA, Jack became the first student to letter in 4 sports in the same season: basketball, baseball, football, and track. On the UCLA football team in 1940, Jack finished second in the Pacific Conference in total offense. And then in winter 1941 on the UCLA basketball team, he scored 133 points and won the individual league scoring title. At the end of the 41 athletic season, he withdrew from UCLA without having received a degree. I don't know, he never had a degree from the junior college. I don't know if he would have, well, he must have picked up the necessary course requirements to proceed at UCLA, but he never got a degree at UCLA either. That summer, he played on the Los Angeles Bulldogs minor league football team, for which he was paid $100 per game. And later in the year, 41, he boarded a passenger liner to Honolulu, where he played for another minor league football team with the ironic name, the Honolulu Polar Bears. But homesick, on December 5, 1941, he boarded the passenger ship Lurley back to California. Rapperson writes, on December 7, Jack and some other men were playing poker when they noticed the ship's crew painting the windows black. Soon the captain ordered everyone on deck and broke the news that Japanese airplanes had attacked Pearl Harbor. In April 1942, Jack was drafted into the U.S. Army and completed basic training at Camp Riley, Kansas, now called Fort Riley, where Joe Louis was also stationed. Louis had enlisted in the Army voluntarily, and he said, "We're going to do our part and we will win because God is on our side." And after basic training, both Jackie Robinson and Joe Louis were transferred to Camp Hood, Texas, now Fort Hood, named after Confederate General John Bell Hood. The two of them remained lifelong pals. In civilian life, they frequently played golf and went horseback riding together. And this photo shows the two of them, hopefully this photo shows the two of them sparring at Fort Hood. During his Army days, Jackie Robinson had not yet achieved renown and hero status, but as Rapperson said, Louis was then at the peak of his national fame. Now, in 1937, many of you may know, he defeated the German boxing champion in Berlin, Max, how do you pronounce it? And so he was well known from that, but Jackie Robinson hadn't gotten into Major League Baseball yet at that time. And as an enlisted man, Joe Louis ultimately attained rank as a three-stripe sergeant, frequently referred to as a buck sergeant. And because he had no college education, he was ineligible to become an officer. However, due to his celebrity status, he had influence and contacts far beyond what his rank would suggest. Knowing that Jack Robinson wanted to go to OCS, Officer Candidate School, Joe Louis reportedly telephoned an acquaintance of his named Truman Gibson, who was an assistant secretary of the Army in Washington, and explained Jack's interest in going to OCS, as related by Rapperson. Quote, Gibson then flew to Camp Riley, and at a meeting organized by Louis, he met with Robinson, and shortly afterwards, Jack was assigned to Officer Candidate School. And Rapperson further relates that during OCS training, Jack got into a fierce argument with the training officer who threatened his continuation in the course. And once again, Joe Louis intervened and induced Truman Gibson to bring the matter to the attention of the commanding general. And apparently as a result of Joe Louis's intervention, Robinson was permitted to continue OCS training, at the end of which he was commissioned as a second lieutenant. If you look on this visual, you could see his gold second lieutenant bars on his shoulder. In 1944, while he was stationed at Fort Hood, Second Lieutenant Johnson was court-martialed. And that is the principal subject in this presentation that Keith will be giving, which involved criminal charges brought against Robinson and the court-martial proceedings in the military court's verdict that Keith already indicated. He'll be going into detail, so I'll skip over those matters. However, the day before the court-martial, Robinson's tank battalion began embarkment on troop ships to England, from which the unit crossed the Channel to the continent as part of General Patton's Third Army sweep through France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and Germany and Austria. And in combat, over 300 men in the unit were wounded and 22 were killed. But Lieutenant Robinson remained behind. Citing an injury he sustained in September 1937 while playing quarterback for the Pasadena Junior College football team, he requested exemption from combat. Being an infantry officer requires a man that is physically fit, and since I have been informed that I would be responsible for my further injury, I feel I would not give the government the services that are required of an officer. The Adjutant General's office in Washington responded, inasmuch as Lieutenant Robinson does not desire to be retained on active duty in a limited service capacity, it is desired that orders be issued relieving him from active duty. In November 1944, he was honorably discharged from the Army, quote, by reason of physical disqualification. In spring 1945, Jackie joined the Black League baseball team, Kansas City Monarchs, as shortstop, and he was soon to meet Branch Rickey, the man who would transfer his life and assure his role in baseball and in American history. Following his graduation from Ohio Wesleyan University, I'm going to get a little into Branch Rickey's background. Branch Rickey's graduation from Ohio Wesleyan University in 1903, Rickey coached college baseball teams. He then signed on as catcher for the American League St. Louis Browns and subsequently for a brief period with the New York Yankees. From 1910 to 13, Rickey attended University of Michigan Law School, where he was simultaneously both a full-time law student and coach of the U of M baseball team. Upon graduation with an LLB Bachelor of Law degree, rather than deciding to pursue an exciting career as an attorney, he immediately returned to the St. Louis Browns as team manager. In 1917, when the U.S. Entered World War I, Rickey enlisted in the Army, and he was commissioned as an Army officer by war's end, attaining rank of major. He was discharged in 1919. From 1919 to 42, he was manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. At that time, St. Louis had two major league teams, the American League Browns, for which Rickey played before he enlisted in the Army, and the National League Cardinals, which he now managed. In 1945, he acquired a 25% interest in the Brooklyn Dodgers and proceeded to serve as general manager for that team. In August 28, 1945, 13 days after VJ Day, the end of World War II, Rickey arranged for Jackie Robinson to meet with him in his Brooklyn office. This photo shows the two of them conferring together 5 years later in 1950. Ramperson describes their meeting in 1945. Ramperson, do you know why you were brought here? Rickey demanded. Branch Rickey demanded, and then to play on a new colored Brooklyn team, Jackie replied. No, Rickey corrected him, that isn't it. You were brought here, Jackie, to play for the Brooklyn organization, perhaps on Montreal to start with. Me? Play for Montreal? If you can make it, yes. Later on also, if you can make it, you'll have a chance with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Rickey continued, I'm looking for a ball player with guts enough not to fight back. He then lambasted Robinson and berated him with the N-word, to which Jackie was certain to be subjected if he played for the Dodgers. Rickey then opened the Bible and read from Matthew chapter 5, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other. At the end of the meeting, which lasted 2 hours, Jackie signed an agreement that bound him to the Brooklyn Dodgers. In February 1946, Jackie married Rachel Isom, whom he had first met at UCLA. And together with his mother, Molly, Rachel became the mainstay of Jackie Robinson's life. As shown in this photo, over the next 6 years, Jackie and Rachel had 3 children. Jack Jr., lower left in the photo, Sharon on Jackie's lap, and David on Rachel's lap. For the 1946 season, Jackie Robinson, at age 26, was assigned to play second base for the Continental Minor League Montreal Royals, a Dodgers farm team. He was paid up front $3,500 bonus and $600 per monthly salary. The Royals won the 1946 Minor League Championship playoffs. In his biography, Robinson wrote, "I finished the series hitting .400 and scoring, the winning run in the final game. Montreal crowds swarmed over the field. They hugged me. Women kissed me. Kids grinned and crowded around me. Men took me on their shoulders and went around the field singing and shouting." The next year, on April 9, 1947, 6 days before opening of the Major League season, the Dodgers home office issued the following press release. Brooklyn announces the purchase of the contract of Jack Roosevelt Robinson from Montreal, signed Branch Rickey. That news, although it was anticipated and expected in the sports pages, was not well received by several Dodgers team members, many of whom were from the South. The petition was circulated among them, threatening to refuse to remain on a team with the black. Branch Rickey quickly suppressed the incipient revolt. But when Jack arrived in the locker room, he is met with a frosty reception by those same teammates. One exception was the Dodgers' second baseman, Pee Wee Reese, who befriended Jack from the start, even though rumors were rampant that Jackie Robinson would replace Reese at second base. In fact, Jack was assigned to first base, and Reese retained his position at second. The two-man, Jackie Robinson and Pee Wee Reese, remain lifelong friends. This sculpture, I learned while working on this presentation, is well known in the baseball world. It depicts Pee Wee Reese with his arm around Jackie Robinson's shoulder. The sculpture was dedicated in 2005 at the home field of the Brooklyn Cyclones, a farm team for the New York Mets. Rachel Robinson was a principal speaker at the dedication. In this photo, Jackie Robinson is leaving Ebbets Field on April 15, 1947, after his first game playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers. In Major League Baseball, that date, April 15, is now celebrated, as many of you probably know, as Jackie Robinson Day, when both American and National League players wear Jackie's number 42. And these are examples of that. And even little leaguers wearing number 42. As a side note, although in 1997 number 42 was retired for all major league players, those players who bore for number 42 on their uniforms at that time were grandfathered in and were entitled to continue to wear number 42 for the remainder of their major league careers. In the Detroit Free Press on January 23, 2019, it was reported that New York Yankee pitcher Mariano Rivera, the last player donning number 42, had announced his retirement, and like Jackie Robinson, Rivera was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame upon his first nomination. And as set forth in the Free Press article, he was the first player ever to be elected to the Hall of Fame by unanimous vote, having received 425 votes in balloting by the Baseball Writers Association. This is a photo of Robinson stealing home. Throughout both his minor and major league play, Robinson was an especially adept base stealer. And in this case, home plate. Branch Rickey was fortunate in his selection of Jack Robinson as the first black major league player who established a record as one of the greatest baseball players up to the present time. In 1940s, 47, his first year as a Dodger, he received the Rookie of the Year award. He was selected to play in All-Star games for 6 consecutive seasons from 1949 to 1954. And he played for the Dodgers in 6 World Series, including the team's 1955 championship win over the Yankees. In 1962, he is inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. This photo shows Jackie holding his Hall of Fame plaque with Branch Rickey and his wife Rachel. In his acceptance speech, Robison remarked, "I have had a lot of wonderful things happen to me in my life, but to make the Hall of Fame on the first go-round, where do you put that on the list?" In 1957, the Dodger franchise was transferred to Los Angeles in 1957. And knowing that Jackie Robinson would be unwilling to move from New York, the Dodgers traded him to the New York Giants. Coincidentally, at the same time, Jackie was contacted by the Chock-full Nuts Company, which offered him a position as director of personnel for more than 1,000 employees. He accepted the offer and continued in that job for 7 years until 1964. At age 45, he resigned to accept appointment as co-director of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller's campaign to be the Republican candidate for president in that year's election. His biographer, Arnold Rammer, wrote, "Robinson was a fervent anti-communist. In 1956, he is a solid supporter of the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket and taken with the Republican Party, especially after the Democratic Party convention rejected a report on civil rights. In contrast, Robinson was heartened by Eisenhower's championing of the bill that became the Civil Rights Act of 1957. In December 65, Branch Rickey died at age 84. In his autobiography, Jackie Robinson wrote, "As I mourned for him, I realized how much our relationship had deepened after I left baseball. It was a relationship that made me feel almost as if I had lost my own father. Branch Rickey treated me like a son, and as previously stated, Jackie never knew his own father." During the years following his retirement from baseball, Robinson received numerous awards, tributes, and regularly delivered anecdotal speeches. In the 60s and 70s, he became a vocal supporter of the burgeoning civil rights movement and a proponent of blacks not only as players, but also as baseball team coaches and managers and as team owners. As depicted in these photos, Jackie regularly hobnobbed with celebrities, Eisenhower, President Nixon, Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Rockefeller. By 1970, Jackie's health was rapidly declining. To counteract diabetes symptoms, he was placed on an insulin regimen, and in February 1971, he underwent a cardiac catheterization. The following year, on October 16, 1972, he threw the ceremony first pitch of the second game of the World Series in Cincinnati between the Reds and the Oakland A's. 8 days later, the morning of October 24, 1972, he collapsed at home in Stamford, Connecticut. Rachel called an ambulance, which transferred him to the hospital. He was declared dead on arrival at age 53. And this photo shows his funeral cortege en route to Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. And Joe Louis attended the burial, and Pee Wee Reese was a pallbearer. The road within the cemetery is now called the Jackie Robinson Parkway. Jackie Robinson was survived by his wife Rachel and their daughter and son Sharon and David, who are both married and have children and grandchildren of their own, all of whom are college educated and enjoying successful and stable lives. Jackie and Rachel's firstborn, Jackie Jr., did not survive his father. In 1964, at age 17, he dropped out of high school and enlisted in the Army. Following basic training at Fort Riley, where his father had been stationed during World War II, he was transferred to Vietnam, where in a fierce firefight in which several men in his unit were killed, he sustained a bullet or shrapnel wound in his shoulder, for which he is awarded a Purple Heart. Back home, following his discharge from the Army, while driving at 2 a.m. on Merritt Parkway in New York City, he crashed into a concrete abutment and died in the hospital a few hours later. The top photo of Rachel was taken in 1997 when she was 75, and the bottom photo in 2013 when she was 91. Yeah, and it looks like she's throwing the opening pitch in a baseball game. She's now 97. In 1945, before her marriage to Jackie, Rachel received a bachelor's degree in nursing with honors from UCLA. In 1956, she obtained a master's degree in psychiatric nursing from New York University. Then for 5 years, she worked as a researcher and clinician at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and thereafter became an assistant professor at Yale School of Nursing and director of nursing at Connecticut Mental Health Center. She had received 12 university honorary doctorate degrees and several additional awards and citation. And I just had this final remark. If he were still alive, Jackie Robinson, born in 1919, would now be 100 years old. And I apologize for my voice a little bit. I guess I'm anticipating winter coming on and getting a minor cold. So this, I'll turn over. And the real subject of this presentation is the court-martial of Jackie Marshall, which I skipped over. But you'll get the details now from Keith.
Thanks, Bob. Go get a drink.
Yeah, well, we'll head for the nearest bar after this.
So for the court-martial itself, first of all, Robinson was posted when he was down at Camp Hood. He was posted temporarily to McCloskey General Hospital, which was in the neighboring town of Temple, Texas. And soldiers and civilians would travel to and from the town on local buses that had been hired by the Army. And both, soldiers would have to go into town from time to time. In Jackie's case, he was actually stationed at the hospital in town. So he would go back and forth between the base and the hospital on these local buses. And people who worked at the base in the PX and in food service and so on, all these civilian workers would have to travel back and forth. And one day, Jackie's returning to the hospital from the base on the bus, and he sees the wife of a fellow officer from his black unit on the bus. This particular woman is a very light-skinned black woman who passes for white at the time. And so she's seated kind of midway in the bus, a little bit forward of the rear of the bus, and Jackie goes and sits down next to her because he knows her. The bus driver, seeing this, orders Robinson to go to the back of the bus. He refuses. Robinson was very well aware at the time that the War Department had decreed that Southern Jim Crow laws that treated blacks differently from whites would not be enforced on Army bases or by Army contractors. So knowing he's traveling from an Army base to town on a bus that's commissioned by the Army, he knows that they can't do this, and he refuses. So when they reach the bus station, the bus driver, a Milton Reniger, starts arguing with Robinson, and he's joined in that argument by Beverly Younger, who was the bus dispatcher at the bus station. And Ms. Younger refers to Jackie Robinson in his presence with using the N-word. So things then start to get out of hand. There are civilian white ladies from the bus and others outside, and they're all kind of starting to pile on Robinson and giving him a hard time. Some MPs arrive on the scene because, of course, the Army has MPs patrolling the town and the bus station and anywhere where the soldiers might be. So the MPs ask Jackie if he'd be willing to accompany them back to the base and to the guard shack. They're just really trying to defuse this situation at the time. Jackie agrees, and he goes to sit in the MP's car. At that point, the car is approached by another soldier, a Private Mucklerath. And Mucklerath asks if that N-word lieutenant from the bus if they've got him. And Robinson's sitting right there. And he objects to the racial slur and frankly to the fact that he's being addressed this way by a private when he's a lieutenant and he outranks the guy. And he actually threatens then to break the guy in two. But the MPs at that point, they take Robinson back to the base at Camp Hood. They take him to the guard shack where the MPs work out of, and leave it to the officer in charge to kind of sort things out. The officer in charge at that time is a Captain Wigginton, and he quickly realizes this incident from the bus station is going to be a big pain in the neck, and he doesn't really want a whole lot to do with it. He's near the end of his shift, so he kind of passes the ball off to the next shift commander, who's a Captain Bear. Captain Bear then begins to investigate what happened at the bus station, and arguably that's his job. That's what that's what the head of the MPs should be doing. There's an incident, somebody's been brought in, let's investigate and find out what happened. So according to Captain Bear, he tells Jackie, you sit down in the corner over there, and there's kind of two rooms in the guard shack, and they're separated by a door that has a Dutch door, you know, these ones where the top opens separate from the bottom. And he sends Jackie over to sit down, according to his testimony in the trial. But while he's questioning witnesses in the adjoining room, he claims that Jackie keeps coming to the door and leaning over this Dutch door and interrupting him. And this goes on for quite some time, and Bear is becoming exasperated. And eventually, Jackie is sent back to the hospital, the hospital in town where he's stationed, and kind of put under house arrest. And he does this under protest. He has to repeatedly demand, am I under arrest? Because he had been granted a 24-hour pass, and he wanted to continue with his time off. Subsequent to all this is when the Army decides to prosecute him for essentially insubordination in this time when the Captain Bear is investigating the incident. And apparently, while it's not in the trial record, originally the charges were more extensive and related back to the incident on the bus. But the Army apparently realized that that was going to open a bigger can of worms and perhaps would expose the Army to supporting some of the racial issues that were occurring on the base in this Texas town. So they ultimately just limited the charges to these very limited charges involving insubordination. And so these are the charges that actually appear in there. And you'll see it says that Jack Robinson did at Camp Hood on July 6 behave himself with disrespect toward Captain Gerald M. Bear, his superior officer, by contemptuously bowing to him and giving him several sloppy salutes, repeating several times, "Okay, sir, or words to that effect, and by acting in an insolent and impertinent and rude manner towards Captain Gerald M. Bear. And then the second specification in the charges had to do with him basically refusing to be seated in this chair that Captain Bear told him to sit in, and that he willfully disobeyed him. And I think as you read that, especially that first charge, it really sounds like something that was peculiar to the time and to the racial aspect of the relations between the parties at the time. Like, he's this uppity black man, not just a soldier who's being disobedient, but they make it actually sound, I think, somewhat racial in the context. So Robinson thinks he's being railroaded, and he's worried about the discrimination aspect of it. And you'll recall Bob mentioned that he had been introduced to a Truman Gibson who worked in the War Department, who was a friend of Joe Louis. So Robinson writes to Truman Gibson, and it's actually a 3-page letter, and I was only able to find page 1 and page 3 online. I guess page 2 has been lost, but it's really kind of interesting to read this letter. He writes it to Truman Gibson at the War Department, and the first page he's kind of describing what happened on the bus and the incident. And he writes very well. He says, "On or about the 7th of July, I was at Camp Hood, Texas, visiting the colored officers' clubs, and upon leaving, I took a shuttle from the club to the central station. As I moved to the rear, I noticed one of the officers' wives, and I sat down beside her. The lady is very fair and to many people looks to be white. It's evident that the driver seemed to resent my talking to her and told me to move to the rear. He didn't ask the lady to move, so I refused. When I did, he threatened to make trouble for me when we reached the bus station. Upon reaching the bus station, a white lady tells me she's going to prefer charges against me, and that she heard the driver tell me to move to the rear." And he goes on, and so he's relating in very factual terms what happened on the bus. And then we're missing the second page, but the second to last paragraph of the letter is very interesting. It shows that he's not necessarily real worried about the trial itself now that he's been charged, but he's worried about the publicity. And he'd like to get this publicized. He'd like to use the black press to kind of show how he's being treated. So he's asking for Truman Gibson's advice. "You can see, sir, that I need your advice. I don't care what the outcome of the trial is, because I know I'm being framed, and the charges aren't too bad." So he's kind of recognizing, all right, these charges aren't going to probably result in a real bad penalty, and I'm probably going to be convicted, but he wants to do something about it. So he says, I'd like to get your advice about the publicity. I have a lot of good publicity out, and I feel I have numerous friends on the press. But I first want to hear from you before anything, before I do anything I will be sorry for later on. And then if you look up in the corner, apparently Gibson sent this to somebody else. He says, this man is the well-known athlete. He will write you, follow his case carefully, and he's initialed it with a G. We know that he subsequently kind of advised Jackie, I don't think you should make this a big press case, but the black press did take it up. However, most of their reporting didn't really come out until after the trial was over, just because of the way that the timing on things worked. So anyway, Robinson is sent to trial on these charges, and he's assigned a Lieutenant William A. Klein as his defense counsel. And Robinson indicated in his autobiography that Klein didn't really defend him. And so this is a page from his autobiography. He says, my first break was that the legal officer assigned to defend me was a Southerner who had the decency to admit to me he didn't think he could be objective. He recommended a young Michigan officer who did a great job on my behalf. And he doesn't, in his autobiography, he doesn't identify who that officer was. And as things turned out, Mr. Klein lived to be, I think, 100 years old. And early on, when people would interview him about this, he wouldn't take a lot of credit. But as he got older and older, as people would come to him, and the court-martial was, you know, well publicized. It was a well-known part of Jackie Robinson's history. But because the transcript suggests that Klein is the defense attorney, people would always go to Mr. Klein as they're researching and writing about it. And the older he got, the more credit he took. Okay? And so Mr. Johnson's role was kind of lost to history. But Jackie says in his autograph, he's talking now about Bob Johnson. He had a way of rephrasing the same question in many clever ways so that anyone who was lying would have a hard time not betraying himself. It became obvious during the proceedings the prosecution had rehearsed and schooled their witnesses and done a bad job. My lawyer tricked several of the witnesses into confusing testimony, and luckily there were some members of the court-martial board who had the honesty to realize what was going on, and I was acquitted. So we now know that lawyer was Robert Johnson, the defense lawyer, and notwithstanding the prosecution tried to separate the bus incident from the insubordination. They didn't want anything about the bus talked about at the trial. But Bob Johnson had Jackie testify in his defense at the trial, and he had Jackie testify extensively about what led to him being at the guard shack in the first place. And so the issue of the bus incident did come out at the trial. And this is part of the transcript. So after a couple of pages before this, there's quite a bit of testimony from Jackie about the incident on the bus. And not until the middle of this page 51 of the transcript, the prosecutor realized, well, I should be objecting to this. So he says, I object to this line of testimony. It has nothing to do with the specification. The specification would be the charges. What happened on the bus has no place in this case. And the member of the court-martial board who kind of acts as the judge, he's called the law member, he says, yeah, I don't see the materiality of it. The objection is sustained. But at that point, the damage has been done. Bob Johnson has gotten the preliminary incident before the members of the court-martial board, 2 of whom, by the way, were black officers. So that was really a critical defense tactic for him to make sure that the bus incident got into the record, because he wanted those other black officers on the court-martial board to know what led to Jackie being in this guard shack in the first place. So the prosecution essentially just limits their direct testimony of their witnesses to the descriptions of Jackie being insubordinate, sloppy salutes, leaning over the door, talking in a casual, kind of rude manner to Captain Bear. There's basically 23 pages of testimony from Captain Bear and 11 pages of testimony from Captain Wigginton. But Mr. Johnson, in his cross-examination of those witnesses, was able to introduce into the minds of the judges that Bear and Wigginton had some bias against Robinson. And if you read the transcript of the witnesses, those 2 witnesses, Bear and Wigginton, the 2 captains, you get a real distinct impression that there was a racial bias in the way they were trying to paint Robinson's behavior at the guard shack. So by having Robinson testify in his own defense, Bob Johnson made 3 key points. First, he suggested that there was racial bias in the bus incident that gave rise to the investigation in the first place. Second, he allows Robinson to directly challenge the testimony of Bear and Wigginton regarding what he actually did. Robinson essentially denies that he was giving these sloppy salutes and so on. Third, he presents Robinson as a very articulate and well-spoken witness, and as you read Robinson's testimony, it comes across that way, just like his letter that we saw. It's very well written. He was an articulate guy. He was well educated and articulate. And so by presenting Jackie testifying in his own behalf, he shows him to be this articulate, well-spoken guy, not this uppity black soldier that Wigginton and Bear are trying to present him as. Then Bob Johnson calls some other witnesses as character witnesses to defend Robinson. He calls a Colonel Bates, who testified that Robinson was an excellent soldier and that Bates had actually attempted to have Robinson assigned to his unit because he thought he was such a good soldier. He calls a Captain Lawson, who had previously been Robinson's commander in a prior unit. And Lawson also said, "Robinson's a great soldier. I'd like to have him back under my command." And he calls 2 other lieutenants, Lieutenant Kingsley and Campbell, who both testified that Robinson was an excellent soldier with an excellent reputation. So at that point, the defense rests, and the prosecution makes their ultimately fundamental error. They decide to call some more witnesses to try to bolster their case. And they call Private Mucklerath. You remember Mucklerath is the guy who showed up at the bus station and goes over to the MP's car and says, you know, "Do you have that nigger lieutenant?" Okay, and right in Jackie Robinson's face. So they call Mucklerath, and they ask him if he ever called Robinson the N-word, and he denies it. So this gives Bob Johnson his really best opportunity of the trial then. So the prosecution is questioning Mucklerath here, and he says, excuse me, he's questioning a different witness, and he asks him if he ever heard Mucklewrath use the word nigger, and he says, no, sir. And then at the bottom of this page, they call Ben Mucklewrath. Ask him to identify himself, state his rank. He's Private Ben Mucklewrath, first class, blah, blah, blah. Do you know Lieutenant Robinson? Yes, sir. Do you remember seeing him on July 6, 1944? Yes, sir. Did you ever call him a nigger? No, sir. Now he's cross-examined by Bob Johnson. Private Mucklewrath, do you recall Lieutenant Robinson telling you that if you ever called him a nigger, he would break you in two? Yes, sir. Why do you suppose he said that to you? I don't have any idea what he was thinking. I was just repeating something I'd heard of an incident that happened at Military Police Station at Camp Hood. Do you deny you went to the MP on that truck at the bus station and said, do you have the nigger lieutenant in the car? Do you deny you made that statement? Well, at no time did I use the word nigger. You deny you made that statement. I never used the word nigger at any time, sir. And so then, at that point, Bob Johnson says no further questions, the witness can be excused. And the prosecution at that point rests. So then the defense, Mr. Johnson, calls George Elwood, who had previously testified. He was the MP officer that drove Robinson from the bus station back to the base. So he identifies himself, George Elwood. You testified previously, yes, sir, and he's reminded he's still under oath. Corporal, do you know Private Mucklewrath? Not personally, sir. Would you know him if you saw him? Yes, sir. Did he ever ask you at any time if you had a nigger lieutenant in your car? Yes, sir, he did at the bus station. Now, prosecution probably should have just left it there, but they decided to question him. Where was Lieutenant Robinson at the time? Well, I had him sitting in my vehicle. To your knowledge, could Lieutenant Robinson have heard him ask that question? Well, yes, sir, I guess he could. So at that point, I think the prosecution realized, well, I need to shut up and stop. I'm just digging myself a bigger hole. So at that point, the trial ends, and the military board finds Jackie not guilty of all charges, and this is the findings at the end of the transcript. It says he's not guilty on all specifications, and therefore acquits the accused. You know, we don't know for sure what would have happened if Jackie had been convicted of this, but you know, it's certainly possible that he might not have been chosen as the first guy to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers with something like that on his record. But Bob Johnson did a real terrific job of getting all the things he needed to get in front of that court-martial board so that they would acquit Jackie on that fateful day. So now what I'd like to do is meet Bob Johnson. So this is Bob in his Army uniform. He was born June 6, 1914 in Battle Creek, Michigan. His parents were Mason Johnson and Arlene Johnson. Bob attended the University of Michigan and received his undergraduate degree, a Bachelor of Arts, August 15, 1935. He then attended the University of Michigan Law School, my alma mater and Bob's alma mater, from 1935 to 1938, and he was awarded a Bachelor of Laws, or an LLB degree, from the law school on June 18, 1938. Following graduation, Bob Johnson clerked for Michigan Supreme Court Justice Edward M. Sharp, who was a resident of Bay City, and he practiced law in Bay City before his election to the Supreme Court. And what we have here is a book from my law office just so happens a number of our older law books in our law office came from Judge Sharp's library as an attorney. And you can see his stamp there, E.M. Sharp, Bay City, Michigan, and then Lloyd Bartlett stamped his name underneath that. And I've got another little local connection to Judge Sharp. I'm very involved at the Historic Masonic Temple, and this is one of the windows in the lobby at the temple, and different sponsors have their names on windows at the temple. And I'm quite sure that this is Judge Sharp's window, even though they misspelled his name. They didn't put the E on the end of Sharp. And unfortunately, a lot of our windows like this at the temple, the lettering, people have washed the windows or whatever over the years, and the lettering on the names is somewhat washed off. But that's Judge Sharp's window at the historic temple. And I just learned something Friday. My partner, Mark Brissett, who's here with us today, told me that his desk at our law office that he sits at every day was Judge Sharp's desk. Mark's uncle was also a lawyer, John Piggott, and John Piggott acquired that desk from Judge Justice Sharp, and then Mark's parents acquired it from his uncle and gave it to Mark many years ago, and he's still working at that desk. So, but back to Mr. Johnson's biography. Bob married Wilhelmina Jane Nicholas in Bay City on the day after Christmas, December 26, 1940. And as Bob Sarow mentioned, Jane was a lifelong friend of Betty Sarow, Bob's mother. And Bob was kind enough to do some deep research and found their marriage certificate. So this is Bob Johnson and Jane Nicholas's marriage certificate. And during World War II, before he went into the service, Bob was admitted as a lawyer in Bay City. And Bay City has a book that's known as the Lawyer's Register upon Admission to the Bar in Bay County. And this book is maintained in a glass case in courtroom number 1 at our court facility. And every lawyer who's first admitted to the bar when they're in Bay County, if they take the oath in front of a Bay County judge, signs this book. So Bob has signed it. I signed it back in 1978 when I was admitted. I think my partners who are here, Mark and Walt Fitzhugh, have probably both signed that book. And Bob Johnson signed that book. And we've got the page that he signed. And when I got this, it was fascinating because probably many of you will recognize names. There's Bob Johnson's name about 2/3 of the way down, but there are many other local attorneys who were prominent. Above that, couple of spaces above, Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey was a district judge in Bay County when I was admitted, and I practiced in front of Paul and had trials in his court. A little higher up, about the middle of the page, Janet Kinane. We had very early in Bay County, in November of 1938, we had a woman lawyer admitted to the bar. And Janet was still practicing law in Bay County when I first started practicing in 1978. Joe Favazza Sr. signed this book. Anthony F. Belaski. Tony Belaski was the head of the Democratic Party in Bay County for many, many years, and he was a lawyer, and his son Larry Belaski was elected as a circuit judge in Bay County. Leon Dardis, he was a circuit judge in Bay County. And then probably most important for people here at the Historical Society, Ira W. Butterfield, October 31, 1940, signed that book after Bob Johnson signed it. Ira Butterfield, I believe, Mike, isn't Judge Butterfield's name on the library here in the museum? It's dedicated to Judge Butterfield. He was very active with the Bay County Historical Society. So very, very neat piece of history there. I was very glad we were able to find Bob Johnson's signature in that book. During World War II, Bob served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army in a tank battalion. He was stationed, as we know, at Camp Hood for a time, where his civilian profession as a lawyer enabled him to have this very significant impact on Jackie Robinson's life. He also served in the Army in Italy during the war and served with valor. After the war, Bob returned to Bay City to practice law, and in 1945 he co-founded Bartlett, Johnson and King with Lloyd Bartlett and Dave King. And we've had many, many lawyers in that firm over the years, and today it's Birchler, Fitzhugh, Purtell, and Brissett. Mark Brissett and Walt Fitzhugh are both here today with me. And Bob's retired from our firm. This is a picture of Bob Johnson post-war as he looked when he was practicing law. I have Bob Sarow to thank for finding and saving that picture as a part of the history of our firm and his mom's friendship with Bob's widow, Jane. So he's maybe not quite as handsome as he was when in his military uniform, but a good-looking guy and a nice smile. So one day Bob Johnson came to work in late winter 1951 and went home early because he wasn't feeling well. And we know this because my partner Mark's mom, Monica Brissett, worked as a secretary in our law firm at that time. And she recalled the day that Bob Johnson went home not feeling well. And the next thing anybody at the law firm knows, Bob's been transferred down to U of M. He was actually gravely ill, and the hospital records indicate that Bob suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and he had an operation for that hemorrhage on March 7, 1951, and he died at U of M Hospital on March 9, 1951. He was only 36 years old. So Bob Johnson's life was very short, but it was significant. In addition to his place in history with Jackie Robinson and his life in the law in Bay City, he left behind a young widow, Jane, who spent most of the rest of her life in Bay City, and whose family, the Nicholas family, has made very significant contributions in our community. Jane's brothers, Art and Harmon, were both successful entrepreneurs, and Art's Family Foundation has made substantial philanthropic gifts in our community. Bob and Jane also left behind 2 children, and we're very pleased today to have Arlene Johnson-Stremming and Howard Johnson with us. Howard and Arlene, would you please stand up, please? Arlene came all the way from Arizona to be with us today. So on April 15, 2019, which, as you've heard, is Jackie Robinson Day, United States Army Major Adam Kama made a presentation on the court-martial of Jackie Robinson and identified Robert H. Johnson of Bay City publicly for the first time as the defense lawyer who played a key role in Robinson's acquittal. As the successors to Mr. Johnson and his law firm, Bob, Sarow, I, and my partners had the privilege of attending that presentation along with the members of Mr. Johnson's family on that historic occasion. And here's Major Kama. He's in room 200 Hutchins Hall, which is in the law school. That's the room where I had my very first class as a law student. And it also is the room in which the Army trained JAG officers. Here's a picture of Major Kama showing Bob Johnson up on the board there. And so during World War II, in 1942, the Army moved all classes for the JAG Corps to the University of Michigan. And JAG Corps officers were educated at U of M Law School until 1946, when classes were discontinued. And then in 1951, the Judge Advocate General School was moved to the University of Michigan, or University of Virginia, where it remains today. But here's a picture of, these guys are all JAG officers in training at U of M Law School during World War II. They're marching on the Law Quad. That building behind them is the Law Quad on the State Street side. So this picture would have been taken pretty much from the main entrance to the law library. And here we have the Johnson extended family on April 15, 2019, standing in front of the entrance to the law library on the Law Quad, getting their picture taken with Major Kama and holding a picture of Bob Johnson, their father and grandfather. And we also have a picture of myself and my partners with Howard and Arlene and Major Kama in front of the law library there. So that's really the end of the story of Jackie Robinson and Bob Johnson of Bay City, but there's one final reveal that Bob has for you. So, Bob?
This is what everyone's been waiting for, I'm sure.
Bob's going to answer the question, who is this man?
Now, on April 15th this year, Jackie Robinson Day, the Washington Post ran this article with the heading, "The first American Major League Baseball player isn't who you think." That player was Moses Fleetwood Walker, known by the nickname Fleet. And there's a heading of the article in the Washington Post on Jackie Robinson Day. Fleet Walker was born in Ohio in 1856, the son of the first black physician in Ohio, who later became a Methodist Episcopal Church minister. In the 1880s, as a student baseball player for Oberlin College, he was recruited, Fleet Walker was recruited as a student baseball player for Oberlin College by the University of Michigan, for whose team he achieved a .308 batting average. In 1881, while he was a student ball player at U of M, he also played for a Cleveland semi-pro team. Like Jackie Robinson, he withdrew from college, U of M, before receiving a degree, and played as a catcher on the Toledo Blue Stockings, affiliated with the Northwest League, which has been characterized as the first major baseball league in the United States. In 1884, due to financial problems, the Blue Stockings released several of its players, including Fleet Walker. During the remainder of the 1880s, Walker played on various minor league baseball teams. His first wife died in 1895, and 3 years later, he remarried, and by that time, his baseball career had ended. But his adventurous activities continued. In a bar fight in 1891, he fatally stabbed his antagonist, for which he was prosecuted for second-degree murder. His defense at trial was self-defense, and the all-white jury found him not guilty. 4 years later, in 1895, he was prosecuted for mail robbery, of which he was convicted and served a 1-year prison sentence. In later years, Fleet acquired an ownership interest in the Steubenville, Ohio hotel, and according to Wikipedia, he became a respected businessman. Also, he patented inventions that improved film reels. In 1908, he published a book titled Our Home Colony, and he died in 1924 of pneumonia at age 67. Now, the factor that the Jackie Robinson proponents would quibble with is this league that he was played on, the Northwest League, which indicates is the first major baseball league. Does that should that be interpreted that he was in fact the first black major league player? But that's a little side situation that might be a good bar bet sometime on that. So that's that it might not have been worth coming to this because Jack isn't the true first black player then. But we thought we'd add that in, and that just, if I hadn't seen that, it was this Washington Post article was republished in, I think, the Detroit Free Press. It might have been in the Bay City paper, and it just coincided with our event at University of Michigan on the same date then.
Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, we'll try to answer, but thank you.